The city had always known Eleanor Whitmore as a woman who never lost. For more than 30 years, she had built one of the most powerful technology companies in the country. Newspapers often describe her as fearless. Business magazines called her the Iron Lady of Innovation. People who worked for her simply said she was brilliant and impossible to argue with. Eleanor had not been born into wealth. She grew up in a small house with peeling paint and thin walls that could not keep out the winter wind. Her father worked long hours repairing machines, and her mother stitched clothes for neighbors to earn a little extra money. From a young age, Eleanor understood that nothing in life would be handed to her. She studied harder than anyone in her class. While other children played outside after school, she stayed at the kitchen table reading books about science, computers, and business. Her parents worried she worked too much, but they were also proud. They knew their daughter carried a quiet determination that was rare. Years later, that determination changed her life. She started a small software company with 2 friends in a rented office above an old grocery store. The room was so small that their desks touched each other. In the winter, they worked with their coats on because the heater barely worked. But Eleanor believed in their idea with every part of her heart. She worked late into the night writing plans, meeting investors, and fixing problems others thought were impossible. Slowly, the company began to grow. 10 years passed, then 20. By the time Eleanor reached her mid-50s, the small company had turned into a giant corporation that employed thousands of people. Their technology was used in homes, hospitals, and schools all over the world. Money followed success. A lot of it. Soon Eleanor became one of the richest women in the country. She bought a beautiful mansion on the edge of the city, surrounded by tall trees and quiet gardens. The house had large windows that looked over a private lake, marble floors that shine like mirrors, and rooms that were bigger than most apartments. But even with all that luxury, Eleanor remained the same person in many ways. She woke up early every morning. She reviewed company reports before breakfast. She attended meetings with the same sharp focus she had when she was young and struggling. People respected her, but they also feared her. She did not tolerate laziness or dishonesty. If someone lied or failed to do their job, Eleanor noticed immediately. Her words would be cold and direct, and many employees left her office feeling nervous. Still, no one could deny her intelligence. Investors trusted her decisions. Board members listened carefully whenever she spoke. For years, it seemed like nothing could slow her down. Then one evening, everything changed. It was late autumn, and a cold rain had started falling over the city. Eleanor had just finished a long meeting with international partners. Her driver was sick that day, so she decided to drive herself home. The roads were dark and wet. Streetlights reflected on the pavement, like broken pieces of gold. Eleanor was tired but alert. She had driven that road hundreds of times before. The mansion was only 15 minutes away. But sometimes life can turn in a single moment. As Eleanor approached a quiet intersection near the river, another car suddenly slid through a red light. The driver had lost control on the wet road. Everything happened in seconds. The loud crash echoed through the empty street. Metal twisted. Glass shattered across the asphalt. When emergency workers arrived, they found Eleanor trapped inside the car. She was still conscious, but she could not move, not even a finger. The ambulance rushed her to the hospital, while flashing lights cut through the rain. Doctors and nurses worked quickly through the night. Hours later, the results became clear. The damage to Eleanor's spine was severe, very severe. She had survived the accident, but the injury left her paralyzed from the neck down. When the doctors explained the situation, the hospital room became painfully quiet. Eleanor listened without speaking. Her eyes stared at the ceiling, while the words slowly settled into her mind. Her body would never move the same way again. The woman who once controlled boardrooms and billion-dollar deals could no longer even lift her own hand. News of the accident spread quickly. Within hours, reporters gathered outside the hospital. Television channels discussed the future of Eleanor's company. Investors worried about leadership. Analysts debated what would happen next. Inside the hospital, however, the situation felt very different. Eleanor spent long days staring through the window beside her bed. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped softly around her. She had always been surrounded by busy meetings, phone calls, and important decisions. Now her world had become a quiet room filled with white walls. At first, many visitors came. Business partners arrived with flowers and polite smiles. Board members promised to keep the company stable. Even distant relatives appeared, offering warm words and concerned faces. But something about those visits felt strange. Their voices carried sympathy, yet their eyes often moved around the room, studying documents and whispering with lawyers in the hallway. Eleanor noticed everything. Even without speaking much, her sharp mind remained exactly the same. Weeks later, doctors finally allowed her to return home, but her life had completely changed. The Whitmore mansion, once a place of comfort, now felt like an unfamiliar world. Medical equipment filled several rooms. Special beds, machines, and monitoring devices were installed to help keep her stable. A team of professional caregivers was hired to assist her every hour of the day. At first, it seemed like the arrangement would work. But caring for someone with Eleanor's condition required patience, attention, and emotional strength. Many caregivers arrived with confidence, but soon realized the job was far more difficult than they expected. Some felt intimidated by Eleanor's reputation. Others simply could not handle the pressure. One nurse left after only 3 days. Another resigned within a week. Soon the mansion staff noticed a pattern. New caregivers came in with hopeful smiles, but many quietly packed their bags not long after. Some said the work was too demanding. Others whispered that Eleanor's strong personality made the job stressful. The truth was probably a mixture of both. Eleanor remained sharp and observant, even though her body could not move. If someone made a mistake with her medicine or ignored her instructions, she expressed her frustration, clearly using small eye movements and a communication screen. Not everyone appreciated that. Months passed, and the list of former caregivers grew longer. Behind the large gates of the Whitmore mansion, something unusual was happening. The richest woman in the city was slowly becoming one of the loneliest. Staff members did their duties, but few formed real connections with her. Most treated the job like a temporary assignment. Meanwhile, Eleanor's relatives began visiting more often. Some of them had rarely spoken to her before the accident. Now they arrived with gifts, asking polite questions about her health and the future of the company. They spoke softly to lawyers and managers while walking through the mansion's hallways. The housekeeper noticed the quiet conversations, but said nothing. Eleanor noticed them too. Though she could not walk or stand, her mind remained sharp enough to read the tension in every room. She understood something many others had not yet realized. People were already thinking about her life after she was gone. One evening, after another caregiver announced she would be leaving the job, the mansion manager sighed deeply while reviewing the schedule. Finding reliable help had become almost impossible. The position paid very well, yet experienced nurses still refused to stay long. Word had spread among medical agencies that caring for the famous billionaire was an exhausting responsibility. As the manager stared at the empty schedule for the coming week, a quiet worry settled in his chest. For the first time since Eleanor built her empire, the powerful woman who once commanded thousands of employees had no one truly willing to stay by her side. And outside the mansion walls, in another part of the city, a struggling delivery worker was about to cross paths with her life in a way no one could have imagined. Across the city, life moved in a completely different rhythm. In a small, crowded apartment, a young delivery worker lived with his mother and younger sister. The apartment was cramped, with peeling walls and a narrow kitchen where the air always smelled faintly of cooking oil. Money was always tight, and every day brought new worries about bills, rent, and the small medical expenses for his mother. The young man had grown used to hard work. From early morning until late at night, he carried boxes, groceries, and parcels through busy streets. He knew every shortcut, every traffic signal, every corner of the city like the back of his hand. His hands were calloused, and his clothes often smelled of the streets, but he never complained. He did what he had to do. That rainy afternoon, he was assigned to deliver groceries to a large mansion on the edge of the city. The address itself was enough to make him pause for a moment. The Whitmore mansion was famous, its walls and gates visible even from a distance, guarded by security cameras and tall fences. He had heard stories about the billionaire who lived there, a woman who once ruled her company with unmatched authority. As he drove through the wet streets, his mind wandered. How strange it was, he thought, that someone could have everything and yet be alone. He wondered what her life was like now, after the accident, how she spent her days in that massive house all by herself, and whether anyone truly cared for her. When he arrived at the mansion, a quiet tension greeted him. A few staff members moved hurriedly, speaking in low voices. A nurse was talking on the phone, and a housekeeper was busy rearranging a room. The young man carried the boxes to the large, echoing hallways, careful not to trip over the medical equipment that had been installed after the accident. He finally reached the room where Eleanor was. At first glance, she appeared as just another person in a hospital bed. But as he looked closer, he realized she was unlike anyone he had ever met. She lay there, silent, immobile, yet her eyes held a depth that spoke of strength and intelligence. It was clear that this was not a weak or helpless person. She had simply been betrayed by circumstance, and her body no longer allowed her to move freely. The staff spoke among themselves, frustration clear in their voices. They complained about the difficulty of caring for someone with such strict routines and high expectations. He listened quietly, but something inside him stirred. No one seemed to notice the loneliness in her eyes. No one seemed to care that she was trapped, not just by her body, but by the fear and selfishness of those around her. When the housekeeper noticed him lingering, she smiled politely. "You can leave these here. Don't touch anything else," she said, motioning toward the bed. But he hesitated. Something made him speak up, his voice soft but firm. "I could help, just for a little while. If you need me." The room fell silent. He had no medical training, no experience with people who were paralyzed. It seemed absurd to even suggest it. Yet, for some reason, the offer remained in the air. No one else had offered real help in weeks, and the manager of the mansion, desperate and frustrated, finally nodded. "All right, but just simple things. Make sure she is comfortable." At first, he didn't know what to do. Eleanor's needs were complex. She had medications that had to be taken at precise times, meals that had to be prepared in certain ways, and a strict routine that could not be broken. But he approached the work differently than anyone else had. Instead of rushing through tasks, he explained what he was doing. He talked to her as if she could understand everything, even when she could only move her eyes slightly. He treated her with patience, with respect, with humanity. Over the next few days, something remarkable began to happen. Eleanor responded to him, not with words, but with small movements, the flicker of her eyes, the slightest nod. She had not reacted this way to anyone else. The young man continued his simple, thoughtful care, unaware of the profound effect he was having. Each day, he learned more about her routines, her preferences, the exact way she liked her meals prepared, how the blinds should be adjusted, how to communicate with subtle signals. And in return, Eleanor began to show a kind of trust that had been missing for months. She followed his movements with her eyes, and sometimes her lips would curl slightly, a hint of a smile. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The mansion staff noticed a change too. They whispered among themselves, surprised that this young man with no experience could connect with her when so many trained professionals had failed. Some were skeptical, some were intrigued, but all were quietly observing the bond that was forming. Outside, the world continued as usual. Business meetings took place. Investors discussed the company's future, and distant relatives continued to watch for signs of weakness. But within the mansion walls, something else was happening, a quiet revolution of care and humanity, led not by money or status, but by simple empathy. One afternoon, as the rain poured down against the mansion windows, a power outage occurred. The monitors beeped, and alarms rang through the halls. Staff members panicked, unsure how to manage the situation. The young delivery worker, however, remained calm. He guided the nurses, checked equipment, and stayed with Eleanor until the backup power restored the machines. In that moment, Eleanor's eyes followed him closely. Though she could not speak, her gaze expressed gratitude and a silent understanding that she had never experienced before. She was beginning to feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally. As weeks turned into months, his role became more essential. He was no longer just a temporary helper. He became the person who understood her, who communicated with her, who treated her like a human being rather than a challenge or a burden. In return, Eleanor began to open up in small, subtle ways, sharing her thoughts and feelings through her eyes, expressions, and the communication devices provided by the mansion. The young man did not care about her wealth, her fame, or her power. He only saw the person who had once built an empire, now trapped in a body that could no longer obey her commands. And he cared deeply about her well-being. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt seen, heard, and understood. It was during one quiet evening, as he adjusted her pillows and helped her sip water, that the full weight of the situation became clear. No one else had truly stayed with her. No one else had invested this much time, patience, and care. She realized that the presence of this young man, so humble, so ordinary in the eyes of society, was more meaningful than the grand gestures of her wealthy relatives or the professional expertise of the nurses who had come and gone. And for the young delivery worker, the experience was transforming too. He had always worried about his own life and struggles, but in caring for Eleanor, he began to see something larger. He realized that wealth, fame, and power did not make a person truly important. Compassion, patience, and understanding did. That understanding was changing both of their lives in ways no one outside the mansion could yet see. But as they grew closer, challenges remained. Some relatives continued to visit, eyes filled with suspicion. Professional staff occasionally questioned his methods. And outside the mansion gates, the world was watching, waiting to see how the famous billionaire's life would unfold now that a young delivery man had entered her life. Little did anyone know, this humble, unassuming young man was about to become the most important person in Eleanor's life, the one who would help her regain not only a sense of connection, but also the courage to face the future, a future that many believed was already decided without her. Days turned into weeks, and the young delivery worker's presence in the mansion became a constant, reliable part of Eleanor's life. Each morning, he arrived with a quiet determination, carrying supplies, adjusting her pillows, and preparing her meals exactly the way she liked them. His hands moved with a careful precision that showed he had learned quickly. The mansion, once full of tension and chaos, slowly began to feel calmer. Eleanor began to respond more. She learned that she could communicate in new ways with the young man's help. A blink meant yes. A glance to the left meant no. Tiny expressions, slight movement of her fingers, subtle changes in her breathing. All of these became a language they shared. It was a language born out of necessity, but strengthened by trust. Unlike the other staff, he did not treat her like a task to complete or a problem to solve. He treated her like a person, someone with thoughts, feelings, and dignity. Sometimes he would talk about simple things. The rain outside, a bird landing on the balcony, or a funny incident from the street during his deliveries. Eleanor began to react, smiling faintly, her eyes lighting up as if she were remembering a part of herself she had thought lost. The mansion staff noticed the difference. Some were curious, some skeptical. A few whispered that he was naive, that a delivery worker could not possibly handle such responsibility. But others saw the change in Eleanor. She seemed more alert, more comfortable, more alive. Slowly, she began to rely on him more than anyone else. He learned the rhythm of her days. He understood the importance of timing, of keeping routines consistent. When she needed to rest, he let her rest. When she wanted to communicate, he gave her his full attention. He listened to her silence, noticing the small signals that indicated her desires and discomforts. Each day, the bond between them deepened. One evening, after a long day of caregiving, the young man sat in the chair beside her bed. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the machines and the occasional tap of rain against the windows. He looked at her and spoke softly, telling her about his family, about his mother's cough that had worsened that week, about his sister's school project that was giving her trouble. Eleanor listened, her eyes following every movement, her subtle expressions showing that she understood. For the first time in months, she felt a real connection with another human being. The loneliness that had been a constant presence in the mansion was slowly lifting. She felt seen, acknowledged, and understood in a way that money and status had never allowed. The young man, too, began to feel a change in himself. Caring for Eleanor was challenging, yes, but it also gave his life new meaning. He had spent years simply surviving, doing what he had to do to support his family. Now, he was doing something that mattered in a deeper, more profound way. He realized that his actions had a real impact, that his care could bring comfort and dignity to someone who had been overlooked by the world. As their routine continued, challenges arose. Some relatives came to visit, their faces polite but their eyes sharp and calculating. They spoke in hushed tones about business, about power, about controlling the company. They underestimated the young man, assuming he was too inexperienced to understand what was happening. But he noticed everything. He watched how they moved, how they spoke, how they tried to manipulate situations. And he remained vigilant, always ready to protect Eleanor from unnecessary stress. One afternoon, a nurse arrived with an attitude of superiority. She had experience, she claimed, and she intended to take control of Eleanor's care. She criticized the young man's methods, pointing out mistakes that were minor or non-existent. The young man remained calm, politely explaining why he was doing things a certain way. Eleanor's eyes followed the exchange, and she blinked in a subtle affirmation of his approach. The nurse left frustrated, realizing that she could not undermine the trust that had been built between them. Slowly, Eleanor began to regain confidence in herself. She had been paralyzed physically, yes, but her mind remained sharp. With the young man's support, she started to engage in decisions about her life and her company again. She used her communication devices to give instructions, to express opinions, to participate in meetings from her room. It was not easy, but with patience and care, she began to reclaim a sense of agency. Their bond became something that no one in the mansion could ignore. Staff members who had doubted the young man began to respect him. Even relatives who had initially seen him as a temporary obstacle began to recognize that he was not going anywhere. He had become indispensable, not because of wealth or status, but because of trust, empathy, and dedication. One day, while adjusting her pillows and helping her sip a drink, the young man noticed something in Eleanor's expression. It was a fleeting moment, a brief change in her eyes, but it spoke volumes. She was trying to communicate more than a simple yes or no. She wanted to share a thought, to express something meaningful. He leaned closer, attentive, and waited. The small signal she sent slowly formed words through the communication device. It was a message of gratitude, quiet and heartfelt. Eleanor wanted him to know that he had made a difference, that his presence had brought comfort and hope to a life that had seemed trapped in darkness. The young man felt a swell of emotion. He realized that this bond, built not on wealth or power but on genuine care and understanding, was transforming both their lives. Eleanor was not just a patient to him. She was a person he deeply respected and cared for. And she, in turn, had found someone who saw her humanity beyond her disability, someone who valued her thoughts and presence above all else. As months passed, the mansion slowly changed. The atmosphere became warmer, quieter, more peaceful. The young man's presence brought stability, and Eleanor's regained confidence influenced everyone around her. Staff members began to treat her with greater respect and understanding. Visitors noticed the calm, almost serene environment, and some began to realize that this change was due to the simple, steady care of someone who had no obligation beyond kindness. Evenings were often spent in quiet companionship. The young man would tell stories of the city, of everyday life, of small joys and struggles. Eleanor listened, reacting with subtle movements, her eyes reflecting emotion, her lips sometimes curling into a faint smile. It was a world of understanding and connection, built from patience, observation, and empathy. One rainy evening, as the city streets shimmered with reflections from the wet pavement, a sudden crisis occurred. One of the machines monitoring Eleanor's condition began to beep loudly. The staff panicked, unsure how to respond. The young man immediately assessed the situation, checking the equipment and stabilizing her until everything was back in order. Eleanor's eyes followed him with a steady gaze, full of trust and relief. He had become not just a caregiver but a protector, someone whose presence had calmed both her and the chaos around her. Through these experiences, both Eleanor and the young man grew in ways they could not have imagined. Eleanor began to accept that her life had changed dramatically, but that she could still exert influence, make choices, and feel a sense of control. The young man, in turn, realized that compassion and care could transcend social class and wealth. True connection, he understood, came not from money or status, but from respect, understanding, and patience. And so, in the quiet mansion on the edge of the city, their lives intertwined. The billionaire who had once ruled boardrooms found a confidant, a supporter, and a friend in a young man who had delivered groceries to her door. He had no idea at first how important he would become, nor how deeply his actions would affect someone so powerful yet so vulnerable. But as days passed and trust deepened, it became clear that this was a turning point, a moment where two lives from completely different worlds began to shape each other in profound and lasting ways. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and struggle, became a place of quiet resilience and hope. And at the heart of it all was a bond that no wealth or power could buy, a bond formed from simple, human care, patience, and understanding that neither Eleanor nor the young man would ever forget. As Eleanor grew stronger in her mind and more confident in her daily routines, new challenges began to surface. Some of her distant relatives, who had barely been involved in her life before the accident, suddenly became more present. They visited the mansion frequently, always polite, always concerned, but their eyes betrayed something else. They were calculating, watching carefully, trying to see if they could find a way to gain control over her empire. The young delivery worker noticed the subtle changes immediately. He had grown accustomed to reading Eleanor's cues and the tone of the household. He watched as the relatives whispered to lawyers in the hallway, their expressions tight with hidden agendas. Though he had no formal knowledge of corporate law, he understood enough to know that Eleanor's fortune and company could be at risk. One afternoon, while helping Eleanor adjust her position and feeding her lunch, he overheard a conversation in the next room. Two of her cousins were speaking quietly but urgently, unaware that he was listening. They were discussing legal documents and strategies to challenge Eleanor's ability to make decisions for herself. They spoke of using forged medical reports and questionable claims to convince the court that she was no longer capable of managing her company. The words hit him like a cold wind. Eleanor had fought so hard for everything she had, and now, people she barely knew were plotting to take it away. He felt a mix of fear and determination. He could not let them hurt her, not in any way. But he also knew the limits of what he could do. He was just a delivery worker, someone who had stepped into this world out of compassion and empathy. Still, he refused to ignore what he had heard. That evening, he spoke softly to Eleanor, explaining what he had overheard. She listened intently. Her eyes focused on him with intensity. Though she could not move freely, she could make decisions, and she understood exactly what was at stake. With his help, she began to plan. They called on an old lawyer, someone who had worked with Eleanor before the accident and who still trusted her judgment. The lawyer visited the mansion, carefully reviewing the documents and the potential threats. With Eleanor's guidance, communicated through her device and subtle eye movements, they began to build a case against the relative schemes. Days passed in a tense rhythm. Every visit from a relative was now watched with caution. The young man remained vigilant, staying by Eleanor's side through each meeting, each discussion, each potential manipulation. He had become more than a caregiver. He was a protector, a shield against greed that threatened to destabilize her life. At times, the relatives grew frustrated. They could not understand why their usual tactics, polite persuasion, subtle intimidation, were failing. The young man's presence, his steady attention and unwavering support for Eleanor, had disrupted their plans in ways they had not anticipated. They could not manipulate her as easily with someone who genuinely cared by her side. One morning, as the sun filtered softly through the mansion windows, a confrontation occurred. The relatives attempted to bring in a medical professional who would support their claims about Eleanor's incapacity. The young man calmly but firmly explained that all care decisions were being made according to established medical protocols, and that Eleanor's wishes were being fully respected. The medical professional, impressed by the young man's understanding and the clarity of Eleanor's communication, left without further argument. The relatives were left speechless. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and the young man worked together tirelessly. They reviewed documents, communicated her decisions to board, and ensured that her voice was heard clearly in all matters concerning her company and her personal affairs. It was exhausting work, filled with tension and uncertainty, but it also strengthened the bond between them. Eleanor had regained a sense of control, and the young man had discovered a strength within himself he had never known existed. One evening, after a particularly long day, Eleanor rested quietly while the young man sat beside her bed. He spoke softly, recounting stories from the streets of the city, small incidents that made them both smile despite the heaviness of the day. Eleanor's eyes followed him attentively, and for a moment, the weight of the legal battles and familial betrayal seemed to lift. They found comfort in each other's presence, a rare reprieve from the pressures surrounding them. The relatives, growing increasingly desperate, tried subtle acts of intimidation. They questioned staff members, tried to influence medical assessments, and even attempted to sow distrust between Eleanor and her young caregiver. But their efforts were futile. The trust between Eleanor and the young man was too strong, too genuine, and too deeply rooted in mutual respect and care. Then came the pivotal moment. The old lawyer, after careful review, discovered clear evidence of the relatives' attempts to manipulate documents and falsify reports. With Eleanor's approval, they presented the evidence to the board and, when necessary, to the courts. The relatives were exposed, their plans unraveling before their eyes. For the first time, Eleanor's authority and intelligence, though expressed in a non-traditional way, were undeniable. Through the struggle, Eleanor's confidence grew. She realized that even though her body could not move freely, her mind remained as sharp and commanding as ever. With the young man by her side, she could navigate the complexities of her life and protect what she had built. She understood the value of loyalty, of empathy, of someone who saw her as a person rather than a fortune. The young man, in turn, felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known. He had entered Eleanor's life as a delivery worker, someone with little power or influence. Yet, through patience, empathy, and steadfast care, he had become indispensable. He had not only protected her, but had also helped her regain her confidence, her voice, and her control. As the dust settled from the confrontation with the relatives, the mansion became a place of quiet, relief, and reflection. Eleanor's company was secure, her personal life protected, and the young man remained by her side, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine bond that had formed through shared struggle and mutual respect. Evenings were spent in quiet conversation, storytelling, and gentle companionship. Eleanor's eyes followed every movement of the young man in small expressions, blinks, smiles, slight gestures, communicated feelings that words could not capture. Together, they had created a world within the mansion that was safe, supportive, and deeply human. Through it all, Eleanor realized something profound. She had built an empire, achieved immense wealth, and earned widespread recognition. But none of it mattered as much as the presence of someone who truly cared for her as a person. And for the young man, the experience had changed him forever. He had discovered that true strength was not in wealth or status, but in empathy, loyalty, and the courage to act when it mattered most. And so, in the quiet halls of the mansion, life continued. Eleanor and the young man, from two vastly different worlds, had formed a bond that could withstand greed, betrayal, and the harshest of challenges. They had faced adversity together and emerged stronger, proving that human connection, trust, and compassion were more powerful than any obstacle or scheme. Together, they were no longer simply caretaker and patient. They were partners in facing the world, and nothing could take that away. Months had passed since the young delivery worker had first entered the mansion, and the quiet halls that had once felt cold and lonely were now filled with a sense of calm and stability. Eleanor's confidence had returned, not just in her ability to manage her company, but in her own sense of self. Though her body remained paralyzed, her mind was as sharp and active as it had ever been, and she had learned to trust someone completely again. The young man had become an essential presence in her life. He was no longer just a caregiver. He was a companion, a protector, and someone she relied on for both practical assistance and emotional support. Their bond, forged through patience, empathy, and shared experiences, had grown stronger with each passing day. Together, they navigated the challenges of daily life in the mansion. Simple routines, which had once been overwhelming, were now carried out with ease. Meals were prepared and served, medications were given on schedule, and communication flowed smoothly through devices that allowed Eleanor to express her thoughts. Each day, Eleanor's subtle expressions and eye movements grew more nuanced, and the young man became adept at interpreting them without hesitation. Outside the mansion, Eleanor's company continued to thrive. The board and investors had witnessed her resilience and intelligence, even in the face of her physical limitations. They respected her decisions and recognized the value of her input. The relatives who had once schemed against her had been dealt with, their plans exposed and thwarted. The mansion was no longer a place of tension or fear. It was a sanctuary where Eleanor could live her life with dignity and control. Despite the luxury and wealth surrounding her, Eleanor felt something she had not felt in a long time. Genuine human connection. The young man, with his humble background and quiet determination, had shown her that wealth and power were meaningless without empathy and care. He had brought warmth, laughter, and a sense of normalcy to her life, qualities that money could never buy. One afternoon, as rain softly tapped against the windows, the young man sat beside her bed, recounting stories from his day in the city. He spoke of small, everyday events: a child playing a puddle, an old man feeding pigeons in the park, a street musician playing a tune that made him smile. Eleanor listened, her eyes following his every movement, occasionally blinking or making a subtle expression to show her reaction. Though she could not speak, her responses were clear and meaningful. In return, Eleanor began to share her own thoughts and ideas. Using her communication device, she discussed plans for her company, charitable projects she wished to support, and small personal wishes she had never voiced before. The young man listened attentively, offering guidance and support where needed, and celebrated her achievements and decisions as if they were his own. Their interactions became a seamless exchange of ideas and emotions, a partnership built on trust and mutual respect. One significant change came when Eleanor decided to establish a foundation to support accident victims and their caregivers. She wanted to create a system that would provide both medical assistance and emotional support to those who, like her, had faced life-altering injuries. She entrusted the young man with a leading role in the foundation, recognizing his dedication, compassion, and ability to inspire others. Though he had never imagined a position of responsibility like this, he embraced it wholeheartedly, determined to honor the trust Eleanor had placed in him. The foundation quickly gained recognition. Its program provided not only physical care, but also emotional support, therapy, and guidance for patients and their families. The young man, with Eleanor's guidance, ensured that every decision reflected the values they both held: empathy, respect, and the importance of human connection. Through their efforts, they transformed countless lives, bringing hope and stability to people who had once felt abandoned or overlooked. Within the mansion, life continued with a gentle rhythm. The young man and Eleanor developed routines that balanced care, work, and moments of quiet reflection. Evenings were often spent in gentle conversation, storytelling, or simply enjoying each other's presence. The mansion, once a place of loneliness and tension, had become a home filled with warmth and purpose. As Eleanor grew more comfortable in her new life, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The accident had been devastating, stripping her of physical freedom and independence. Yet, it had also revealed something profound: the power of human connection and the value of empathy. The young man had entered her life at a moment when she needed trust and care most, and together they had forged a bond that transcended wealth, status, and circumstance. For the young man, the experience had been transformative as well. He had entered Eleanor's life as a delivery worker, someone with limited means and no authority. Yet through his actions and dedication, he had become an indispensable part of her world. He had discovered a strength within himself, a sense of purpose, and the ability to make a meaningful difference in someone else's life. In caring for Eleanor, he had found a depth of connection and fulfillment that he had never known before. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows, Eleanor's eyes followed the young man as he moved about the room. She made a subtle gesture, blinking twice and raising her hand slightly, a simple but profound expression of gratitude and affection. The young man understood immediately, a warm smile spreading across his face. In that moment, words were unnecessary. Their bond spoke volumes, a silent understanding that conveyed trust, respect, and genuine care. Over time, Eleanor's influence extended beyond her company and foundation. She became an advocate for the rights of accident victims, speaking at conferences and participating in forums that discussed accessibility, care, and support. Though she could not walk or move freely, her ideas and insights reached far and wide, inspiring change and opening doors for others who faced similar challenges. The young man remained at her side, assisting, supporting, and ensuring that her voice was heard clearly in every setting. Together, they had built more than professional partnership. They had created a life that celebrated empathy, resilience, and human connection. Eleanor's mansion, once a symbol of isolation, had become a center of activity and compassion, a place where people came not only to receive care, but also to witness the profound impact of genuine trust and support. As the seasons changed, the bond between Eleanor and the young man remained unshakable. They faced challenges together, celebrated successes, and navigated the complexities of life with patience, understanding, and unwavering support for one another. Each day, they reminded each other that true wealth was measured not in money or status, but in the ability to care, to connect, and to make a meaningful difference. In the quiet moments, when the mansion was still and the world outside moved on, Eleanor often reflected on the journey that brought her here. She had survived a devastating accident, faced betrayal and greed, and confronted the limitations imposed on her body. Yet through it all, she had found something far more valuable. A human connection that transcended circumstance, a partnership built on trust and compassion, and the realization that even in the most difficult moments, genuine care could transform a life. And for the young man, each day spent with Eleanor was a lesson in courage, empathy, and the power of small, meaningful actions. He had entered her life as a stranger, with nothing but a willingness to help, and had become someone whose presence mattered in ways he could never have imagined. Together, they had shown that true strength lies not in wealth or power, but in the quiet, steadfast act of care that touched the heart and changed the world. In the end, Eleanor and the young man continued to live their lives side by side. Their days were filled with purpose, their nights with quiet companionship. The mansion, once a place of fear and isolation, had become a home of hope and resilience. And through it all, they had discovered truth that would guide them forever. When someone sees you for who you truly are, when someone cares deeply without expectation or judgment, that connection can overcome any obstacle, heal any wound, and transform a life in ways that no wealth, status, or power ever could.